Yeah, so when I submitted this talk to this conference about a year ago, I was thinking I will be on the stage talking to you and telling you a success story. Telling you a success story about how we use the principles of domain-driven design and team topologies and how we used Next.js to make the life of the developers at our company easier. But now, a year later, things didn't turn out quite as I imagined them to turn out. So now, a year later, I'm not even with my former employee anymore. And I thought, should I even do this talk? So the project wasn't as successful as I imagined, although we achieved a couple of things, but not the big success we were hoping for. But then I thought, no, actually, I think I can do an even better talk by also telling about the things that didn't work out. And maybe you can take a lesson or two from what I have to tell you. About myself, my name is Markus Oberlehner, and for what is important for this talk, my role was software architect at Karriere.at, so one of the biggest job platforms in Austria. And nowadays, I'm a software engineer at the Bundesrechenzentrum in Austria, where we are working on making the lives of the taxpayers easier, so making it easier for all Austrian taxpayers to do their taxes. And obviously also a cat, so I really wonder how any of us can even get to write some code sometimes with all the cats annoying us while we are at work. But the most important thing I learned during the last year or so was that although we tend to focus on technologies, especially at conferences like this one, we talk a lot about the frameworks and about all the tools we use and how they use them best. But in the end, what's even more important are the people using those tools and making the people effective at using the tools and working within a larger organization. OK, so this talk is about how we wanted to solve a particular problem at my former company. This talk is about making our organization more effective. And our organization looked something like you can see here. So we had a couple of teams, and those teams were working on particular projects. And therefore, we had teams with particular tools they were using and knowledge and skills the team members had, like using PHP or Java or Vue.js. And the projects they were working with obviously used those languages and tools and frameworks. So far, so good. Then we also had a couple of features. So those are just a few, which were implemented or solved using those tools and the teams were working on. So Team A, for example, was working on those features, and Team B was also dependent or actively working on a couple of other features. And Team C, again, also was working on a couple of the same features and depended on other features. And all of those teams had to communicate with each other. So Team A had to communicate with Team B and Team C, because our organizational structure was in a way that there were kind of random borders between those projects and those features. So there was no clear idea behind what team is responsible for what feature. It all grew organically over a couple of years. So then Team B had also talked to Team A and Team C, for example, and Team C had to talk to Team B and Team A. And we not only had 3 teams, but a couple more teams. So, and as you can already see, this was kind of a mess. So we had a lot of communication overhead, and communication was often an issue and led to projects taking a very long time to get out the door. So we came up with a plan. And our plan was that we use principles from domain-driven design, so that we identify business domains and then also use principles from team topologies, which has a concept of streamlined teams, so we can align the teams with particular domains, and therefore we hope to make them more effective by having clear responsibilities and minimize the dependencies between particular or different teams. And furthermore, we also wanted to build a new platform that enables all of our teams to build web applications, modern web applications, more effectively. And we wanted to use Nuxt for this. First of all, let's start with the first part of our plan. The first part was all about using the principles from domain-driven design. So who of you is familiar with domain-driven design? Yeah, I see quite a few. For those of you who are not familiar with it, here in very short, a couple of the most important aspects of it. So in domain-driven design, we have a concept of an ubiquitous language. And for us, this meant that we came up with particular terms for things that happened within our application. So for example, a recruiter creates a job, a recruiter receives job applications, or an applicant views a job, or an applicant applies for a job. So the point of this is that the organization has a common language or uses a common language, not only when talking to each other, but also in the code. So the correct way of saying things or the correct terms to use in our code were, for example, an applicant applies for a job. And the wrong way would be a user submits an application for an opening, for example. So that way, you can avoid confusion and can make sure that, for example, in your code, you are always using the same terminology. But more important for us was a second concept of domain-driven design, which is domains and bounded contexts. And to find those domains and bounded contexts, we did something called big picture event storming. And big picture event storming involved a meeting with all the relevant stakeholders, or basically with all stakeholders from the company. So we had people from marketing, we had people from sales, and people even from accounting. So we had people from all around the company, and we had this large meeting where we used a bunch of sticky notes, as we all know is so popular right now. And at the end, we came up with a relatively clear picture of the domains and bounded contexts within our company. So we identified 3 business domains. For one, we had a domain job search. We also had another domain active sourcing, and a third domain employer branding. And within those business domains, we identified bounded contexts. And here, just as an example, for the job search domain, we had a bounded context, a search bounded context for the search functionality, a job application context for everything around applying for jobs, and also a job suggestion bounded context when the user doesn't actively search but gets job suggested. And within all the other domains, we also identified various bounded contexts. The second thing I talked about at the beginning, the second thing we wanted to use to reorganize our teams was a method called, or it was how do I call it? Was team topologies, which is basically a way to think about teams and how they interact with each other. Who of you is familiar with team topologies? Not so many, so let's take a short look. In team topologies, there are 4 fundamental topologies or different types of teams. So for example, we have a streamlined team, an enabling team, a complicated subsystem team, and a platform team, according to this method. And most important for us, or for the context of this talk, are streamlined teams. And streamlined teams are aligned on a value stream. And a value stream is something that when the user does it, for example, or something when a user does it provides value to the user, or in some way provides value to the company. And it's basically a complicated way of saying it's a product team. So you can also translate streamlined team to a product team, so a team that works on a single product, and this product is aligned around a value stream. And then you have also interaction modes between those teams. But for this talk, this is not that important, but I highly recommend you to check out team topologies if you think you can improve how your teams work together in your company. And what we thought was that we can use the principle of bounded context from domain-driven design and combine it with the idea of team topologies, and particularly with streamlined teams, to make our organization or to make our teams more effective in their daily work. So at this point, after this big picture event storming meeting we did, we had our domains, for example, our job search domain, and within this domain, we could say, for example, that for the search bounded context, team A is responsible for that, the streamlined team, team A, and for the two other bounded contexts you see here, team B is responsible for that. And why is this more efficient than the structure we had before? Because we identified that those bounded contexts are not as tightly coupled to other bounded contexts as it was with our previous features. So our features we had previously, our model around features, was in a way that we didn't have clear boundaries between those areas. And now with this bounded context, we thought we have clearer boundaries, and those teams we would form around those boundaries could work more independently of each other. But this was only the first part of our modernization and reorganization effort. The second one was that we wanted to build a new platform based on Nuxt that will enable, or that would enable our teams to work more effectively and to build new features more effectively. And what I wanted to achieve is that everyone feels involved. So my role was that of a software architect, and I want to avoid to sit in the ivory tower and say, this is my grand idea, and this is the best thing we can do, and let's do it. But what I wanted to do is to involve everybody and give everybody a chance to participate in coming up with this new stack and the new way of how we want to build web applications in the future. So what I did is I wrote an RFC document. So I wrote a document where I intended my colleagues to add their comments and in that way participate in how we will build our applications in the future. And in this document, I said, I think it would be a good idea to use Nuxt. And within Nuxt, we have multiple layers. So for once, we should have a base layer where we have things like authentication, notification, and all the other functionalities that are shared by all the other teams or by all the other smaller applications within this larger Nuxt-powered platform. And then we have the domain layer where we have all the bounded contexts within this larger platform. For example, the search context, the job application context, and the suggestion context as well. The next piece of the puzzle regarding the new platform and the new way of how we want to build things is that we have a unified UI library. And my idea was that we organize this UI library also in layers also with 3 layers where we have a layer for unstyled primitives, so basic headless UI components, styled primitives, so UI components with our corporate identity already applied to them so that they can be reused by all the teams that rely on the same corporate identity. So for context, we had basically 2 design languages because we had the B2C aspect and the B2B context as well. So and for B2C and B2B, we had different styles. So this is why we wanted to split unstyled primitives and styled primitives, because we could reuse the unstyled primitives between those different ways of how things should look. So we could use the unstyled primitives both for the B2C context and the B2B context. And the styled primitives we would have in 2 variants, one for B2C and one variant for B2B. And the 3rd layer of the UI library contains all the domain-specific components. So all the components that solve a particular business problem. Components that are custom tailored to what we want to do with our application. So as an example, here is an example for an unstyled primitive. This is a select component where we can search for whatever we want to enter here, or we can freely enter text as well. And then we can take this unstyled primitive and make it a styled primitive. This is for the B2C context. So everybody can now reuse this styled version when they are building something for the B2C context. And last but not least, we might have a domain-specific component like the one you can see here. This one is for entering CV data, for example. And this won't be reused across different contexts, but only within one particular context. OK, so I wrote this document where I asked all my colleagues to participate and asked them for their opinion if they think this is a good idea or not. And some of them added comments. So first of all, there weren't that many people who seemed interested, but a few did. Some were rather skeptical, like, I don't know. Others were, whatever, what we currently use is good enough. Why should we care about this? And then there were many that were, yeah, whatever. If he thinks it's a good idea, let's do it, but I don't really care. But in the end, it was accepted. And I was happy, because that seemed good enough. And we moved forward to build this UI platform. So now we had all the building blocks in place to go from something like you can see here, from this mess here, where we had a lot of communication overhead, and where we had really a hard time to get things out the door, to something much more well-structured, like the following. I'll give you a short second to check it out. So the idea with this was that now we have our business domains, and within those business domains, we can say we have team A working, for example, on the search context. We have team B working on the job application context and other contexts, and so on for all the other teams. And we hoped that there shouldn't be that much communication necessary especially between the domains, because the domains should really be very much decoupled from other domains. And there should also be limited communication necessary between teams within a particular domain, because we found those bounded contexts, and those bounded contexts should be relatively decoupled from other bounded contexts as well. And with the platform team that you see below, we hope that we can alleviate a lot of the pain of maintaining always the same UI components. So before we had, I don't know, like 4 different versions of a button, for example, because every team built the same button again. And the only synchronization happened via a static design file instead of in code. And now with the platform team, we hope that the platform team could take care of building high quality and highly reusable UI components with accessibility in mind, for example, and also taking care of building rock-solid solutions for authentication and for notification stuff and all the stuff like that. And the domain teams or the streamlined teams, their only responsibility should be to solve the problems of the users and to solve the problems of their particular business domain. So at this point, everything should be fine. Imagine all the possibilities when you have teams that can work independently and they have a platform team taking care of all the stuff that they need, and they don't have a lot of communication overhead and they don't have a lot of dependencies, and everything should be great. But unfortunately, it wasn't that great. And there are a couple of reasons for this. So what I told you now in a very linear story wasn't that easy already in practice. So after we did this event storming process and after we found these new domains, we started to thinking about actually implementing this new organization. And then there were people realizing, oh yeah, when we do this, then my responsibilities change. And this wasn't clear from the start. So one way in which I failed was that I didn't clearly communicate to the whole of the organization what this actually meant, what this actually will mean if we want to change the things in the way that that I showed you here. And also with this RFC process, it was still, I wanted to avoid the situation of sitting in the ivory tower and presenting the solution that I think is best. But still, it really didn't change that much, because in the end, people didn't really question me because they had a lot of their daily work to do. So I was the only one who had, me and my colleagues were the only one who had the time to actually think about those, think about the bigger picture of our technical frameworks. And so for the other people, it was like, yeah, okay, here is this document, and there are a couple of fancy architecture diagrams, and Nuxt, yeah, sounds okay-ish, let's see. But they didn't really, or I failed to communicate the impact of this, and I failed to really get the people on board and to really make the people involved. So I did go through the motions, like I wrote this RFC document, but in the end, the people didn't really feel that they were involved in coming up with this new idea. So there were a couple of reasons why now I'm standing here and I can't tell a success story as I wanted to tell. I did fail to see that the people are invested in their project. So there were product managers who already had plans in their head what they wanted to do with the features they owned. But if we did the reorganization like I showed you, then they wouldn't be responsible anymore for some of those features. And of course, this didn't go well with some people. Also, I underestimated, or I didn't take into consideration the bonds between team members. So the way how we wanted to go to Nuxt. So of course, we had our legacy systems, and we couldn't just flip a switch and go to Nuxt. The way I imagined it, or the way we imagined it as an architecture team, was that we have to split the projects we had using different technologies like Java or PHP between the teams. And in order to do this, we also needed to move people around teams. So because if one team now is responsible for a PHP application with Laravel, but also some parts of a Java application, then you need the Java know-how in this team, which would have meant that some Java expert needed to move in another team. And some Vue.js expert, for example, needs to move in team C. And again, and again, again, people need to move between teams. And of course, we are friends at work, hopefully. At least in our company, we had very good relations with each other. And of course, people in the teams were friends. And especially with COVID, I think the people focused more on their team. So prior to COVID, there were friendships that crossed teams, but during COVID, it was a situation that people within teams were friendly with each other, but not necessarily across teams. So this also wasn't very popular, that we needed to split teams. And last but not least, this would also have meant that people need to leave their comfort zone. And they weren't quite convinced that this is a good idea for them. So there were a lot of people, especially very involved in the Laravel community, for example. And Laravel is a great framework. And I didn't really show them why I think, or I showed them why I think, but I didn't really convince them why Next.js should be a better option for us than Laravel, for example. So of course, they were not very motivated to now go from what they know from Laravel to a Next.js stack, for example. So the message I show you again here at the end is that although we like to talk about frameworks, and I very much like to talk about new fancy frameworks and new features and new tools and how to make the tools faster, or how to choose the best tool for the job. But what we always have to consider is that people are working on the projects, and we need to take into consideration how the decisions we make about technologies also affect the people working with them. Thank you.